Chapter 145, The Shutdown, 1996. An independent criminal justice consultant testified in federal court that Lorton represents a state of decay and the worst lack of maintenance that he had ever witnessed before, and that abandoned prisoners of war camps look better. Lorton was on the verge of a shutdown. Almost 20 years prior, two convicts had bolted over the 25-foot maximum security wall through a hail of gunfire. In the following year, 8 inmates had escaped from Central. The last straw came when a homie who was a lifer with a long history of escapes dating back to 1975 returned to Lorton after serving his fair time, classified as high security but was placed in a medium security prison. Within months of his placement, in 1994 he escaped again, and 2 months later allegedly killed an armored car guard, taking almost $600,000 in cash. After being recaptured, he was found dead in a jail cell in Maryland. He was one of 13 escapes in 1991. A couple months later, a guy tried to smuggle a gun into the prison stashed in a peanut butter jar. The next month, on Christmas night, another guy serving a 30-to-life sentence walked out of the prison dressed in a police uniform. He had an ongoing relationship with an officer who was working in a gun tower, and while working up there one day, she opened the gate and let him out. He ran to St. Louis, Missouri, then turned himself into authorities after his face was plastered all over the news, then snitched on her. She was arrested and sentenced to prison. Violence inside of the prison is to be expected, but once the violence extended beyond the prison walls, it caught the attention of the politicians in the White House. These few high-profile incidents, coupled with the ongoing violence inside of the prison, pushed the politicians to propose a full shutdown, something that they have been advocating for since the first escapes happened in 1911, a year after Lorton began taking prisoners. 6 people escaped that year. As the community expanded with more residents and homes, the politicians began pushing harder to close the prison as the years passed. The calls for a shutdown became a hot issue in 1963 when the Muslims took control of the prison during an uprising, and again in '68 after Martin Luther King's assassination. Also in '68, a convict named Billy Austin Bryant used a car that he had been working on in a prison automobile shop, crashed it through a chain-link fence connected to a temporary fence. He went on to rob a bank and shooting 3 FBI agents, killing 2 of them. Politicians immediately petitioned to shut the prison down. They tried again in '69 following a riot. Again in '72 when 8 convicts burrowed under a fence, then 5 of them held a family not far from the prison hostage for about 5 hours. Again in '72, 8 prisoners escaped from DC jail. Over 800 federal agents and local police were assigned to recapture them. 5 were rearrested and 3 were killed. 3 correctional officers also faced charges for assisting the escapes. Months later, still in '72, at DC jail, prisoners armed with a .38 revolver took over one section of the jail and held 11 guards hostage, demanding to speak to the DC Corrections Director, Kenneth L. Hardy. While speaking with him, they asked that he come inside to further the negotiations to release the hostages. Once inside, they held him hostage. Lorton had 155 escapes that year and 112 the next. Politicians proposed a shutdown again after 4 prisoners commandeered a shotgun while on a prison bus going from Lorton to DC jail, jumped off of the bus and carjacked a woman in 1973. Lorton escapees were responsible for 2 bank robberies, the abduction of a concrete company manager, and the slaying of an Alexandria detective that year. Then on Christmas Day, 1974, convicts behind the wall were watching a karate movie called The Hong Kong Connection in the chow hall when one of them produced a handgun. He pressed it into the neck of an officer. A few others then pulled knives that overpowered the guards and took their uniforms. They then took control of the watchtower. 4 convicts then escaped by forcing a guard to give up the keys to his Volkswagen Beetle. A guard in another tower opened fire on the escaping Volkswagen, killing one of the convicts. At the same time, over 100 convicts held 9 guards hostage for 18 hours. They were protesting the conditions at the prison. The FBI also started a probe to investigate a drug ring controlled by an organization with ties high up in the district government in 1974. Also in 74, the body of a guard was found stuffed in a manhole. He had been stabbed 17 times with a screwdriver. 10 days later, convict's body was left in a shower stall after being stabbed 37 times. And 20 days later, another convict body was found behind the dormitory. The FBI believed those 3 murders were related to a drug ring at Central. Another riot and 4 escapes in 1980. 3 guards and 3 inmates injured and 15 knives found in 81. Police didn't learn of an escape in 82 until a nearby resident saw a man crawl out of a drainage ditch wearing a jogging suit. A riot involving 200 inmates in 1983, then 5 guards injured and 2 escapes again in 1983. 4 inmates escaped, 9 inmates stabbed, 1 fatally in 1984. Fairfax County Board of Supervisors released a study that suggests the danger of an inmate uprising spilling outside of the prison in 1984. An inmate was killed and another burned in an explosion from a methane gas leak at Youth Center 1 that was traced to the landfill next door, with 400 inmates having to be moved to Youth Center 2, again in 1984. 100 to 150 of those Youth Center 1 inmates stormed into a dormitory in a rivalry with Youth Center 2 inmates in 1985. Police from 3 Fairfax County stations responded with SWAT teams. Tear gas was used to break up the fracas, while inmates hurled rocks at the guards, injuring 3. 250 to 300 inmates staged a 6-hour standoff with guards, with 19 inmates injured in 1986. Another riot left 13 buildings burned, 29 inmates, 9 guards, and 6 firefighters injured again in 86. Another riot in 88 and 89 and a major disturbance in 96. In addition to the dozens of killings and thousands of stabbings, there were 305 escapes by 1975 and another 200 by the time I got there in 1989. In 1997, President Clinton, along with the congressional Republicans, passed the Self-Government Improvement Act in order to take control of DC's budget, which included Lorton. Though a majority of these problems arose out of the lack of funding and severe overcrowding, it finally paved the way for Lorton's closure and DC prisoners to be sent to private and federal prisons all over the country. They had a new facility built in Youngstown, Ohio, exclusively for us. It was a private prison owned by the Nashville-based CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, a privately owned corporation that was traded on the stock market. A private prison is owned by an individual or a group of individuals, and who the state and federal governments auction us off to because of overcrowding or over-budgeting. The lowest bidder with the best package wins 5 to 10-year government contracts to house us. These contracts consist of hundreds of millions of dollars in which the goal of the corporation is to minimize expenses, maximize profits, and cut spending, which meant no schooling, horrible food, and no protection. Part of these private prison contracts also stipulated a minimum occupancy requirement to the government. It was a guarantee that 85% of their cells are always filled, meaning the government has to keep arresting people to fulfill the stipulations of these contracts. The corporations also had lobbyists that lobby lawmakers for harsher sentences for minuscule crimes, which in turn would secure future contracts. And if the government does not fulfill the minimum occupancy requirement, they would have to pay a fee to the private prison corporation, which simply means citizens are punished if they do commit a crime. State governments are punished if they don't. So in essence, we were being sold and leased to the lowest bidder as property. Slaves. Yet, with most of us not fully understanding what was taking place, us slaves assaulted and killed each other over the most frivolous of things. The guards and the CCAs were also paid the minimum wage with minimum experience, and they were regularly attacked also. They were hired by the overseers with no knowledge of what their job entailed. They were rookies being placed amongst experienced and hardened convicts. Convicts that were coming from an institution that they controlled. Lorton. From the school building to the infirmary to the warden's office down to the canteen truck, convicts worked in and ran it. And they were coming to run Youngstown, Ohio also. That's the only way they knew how to do time. It was a warehouse of powder kegs with a brush fire heading its way. I always knew this system was modern-day slavery, but seeing the money attached to our bodies gave me a clearer perspective. Our prison number was nothing but a barcode to be scanned with a price tag attached to it. Dozens of buses were pulling up to Lorton and being loaded with slaves to be shipped all across the country. Since the Ohio prison wasn't even finished being built yet, slaves were being sent to county jails from Virginia to Tennessee to Florida to be held until the prison was ready. Deadlines had to be met with each part of Lorton closing, so they were shipping us everywhere to meet these deadlines. The county jails that held us were being paid exorbitant amounts of money for short-term leases to house us. One night, while still behind the wall, I heard what sounded like a military marching band coming into the cell block. I heard their loud boots marching in unison onto the top tier. They would march and then stop, then march again and then stop, all the while taking orders from a commander and yelling orders to the slaves in the cages. They would stop in front of each of the cells and demand that the prisoner back up to the bars, reach his hands out, cuffed, and then back out of the cell slowly, leaving all of your possessions, then face the wall on the opposite side. They were taking 20 at a time. Then 10 minutes later, they were gone. 10 minutes later, they were back to get more of us. Then it came time for them to get me. My day had come. I was prepared before they came. I blazed some weed, stashed the rest of it, along with my knife, an ice pick, a hacksaw blade, that's for cutting through steel, a pair of handcuff keys, and all my friends' and family's phone numbers, stashed in my hair. My dreads were nice and thick, so I didn't anticipate any complications. Here they come. Let's go.